My father stood at the podium, champagne in hand, surrounded by 50 of his most important colleagues, his retirement party, his moment of glory. And when someone asked about his other daughter, he laughed. "Oh, Bethany, she's just a security guard." The room chuckled. My sister Grace added, "At least she has stable employment." More laughter. I sat at the back table near the kitchen, the seat they assigned me, and I felt every eye in that room look at me with pity, or amusement, or both. They had no idea. For 35 years I was the invisible daughter, the one they forgot to pick up from school, the one whose birthday no one remembered, the one whose credit they destroyed, whose inheritance they stole, whose future they sold for their own comfort. But here's what my family didn't know. While they were laughing at the security guard, I was closing a $68 million deal. While they were toasting my father's legacy, I was about to expose every secret they thought they'd buried. And in exactly 30 seconds, someone was going to scream, because the TV above the bar was about to show my face, my name, my fortune, and my father. He was about to drop that champagne glass and realize his worthless daughter had become more powerful than he ever was. This is the story of how I went from the family disgrace to the woman who brought them to their knees. But I'm warning you now, what my family did to me was worse than you can imagine, and what I did back, that was worse still. Stay with me. This is going to be worth it. My name is Bethany Foster. I am 37 years old, and I am the founder and CEO of Sentinel Shield Security, a company I built from nothing while working night shifts as a security guard. But to my family, I have always been something less, something forgettable, something they could use and discard without consequence. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between a utility bill and a catalog I never ordered. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, the kind of expensive stationery my mother always insisted upon for important occasions. I knew what it was before I opened it. My father's retirement party had been the topic of family group messages for months, messages I received but rarely answered messages where my name appeared only when someone needed to confirm head count. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the card inside. The text was printed in elegant gold lettering, announcing the celebration of Richard Foster's distinguished 40-year career in financial consulting. There would be dinner speeches and a gathering of his most respected colleagues and beloved family members at the Whitmore Country Club. Then I saw my name on the guest list portion, except it was not my name. Not really. The card read, "Staff accommodation confirmed for B. Foster, staff." Not daughter, not family, staff. I stood in my kitchen holding that invitation, and I waited for the anger to come. It did not. Instead, I felt something older and more familiar settle into my chest, the dull ache of being erased by the people who were supposed to love me most. I should have been used to it by now. 37 years of being the invisible daughter should have built calluses thick enough to protect me from paper cuts like this one. But there is something about seeing it written down, printed on expensive cardstock, that makes the wound feel fresh again. They had not even bothered to check the spelling of my name before sending it. Or perhaps they had, and this was simply what they believed I deserved. I considered throwing the invitation away. I walked to the trash can, held the card over the opening, and hesitated. Because this invitation was not just a reminder of everything my family had taken from me. It was an opportunity. The opportunity I had been waiting for, preparing for, building toward for 5 long years. I set the invitation on my counter and let my mind drift backward to the only person in that family who ever made me feel like I belonged. Grandmother Ruth. She was my mother's mother, a woman with silver hair and warm hands, and a voice that made every story sound like a secret meant only for me. When I was a child, I spent every summer at her house, the beautiful Victorian home with the wraparound porch and the garden that smelled like roses and possibility. My parents were always too busy for me, and my younger sister Grace was always too precious to share attention with anyone else. But Grandmother Ruth had enough love for everyone, and she gave most of it to me. She taught me things my parents never bothered to explain. How to balance a checkbook, how to read a contract, how to recognize when someone was trying to take advantage of you. She would sit with me on her porch swing and say, Bethany, money is not about being rich. Money is about being free. Never let anyone control your freedom. I was 12 years old when she first told me about the house. This place will be yours someday, she said, gesturing to the walls that held generations of memories. I am putting it in my will. When I am gone, this house goes to you. Promise me you will take care of it. I promised. I was too young to understand what that promise would cost me. Grandmother Ruth died 3 years later when I was 15. A stroke, they said, quick and unexpected. One day she was teaching me how to bake her famous apple pie, and the next day she was gone. I waited for someone to mention the house. I waited through the funeral, through the reception, through the weeks of paperwork and legal proceedings. Finally, I asked my mother when I would receive what Grandmother Ruth had left me. My mother looked at me with an expression I did not understand at the time, but have come to recognize as guilt, masked by irritation. The will left everything to us, she said. Your grandmother changed her mind before she died. The house belongs to your father and me now. I was 15. I had no money, no lawyer, no way to verify what she told me. So I believed her. I spent the next 20 years believing her, until 5 years ago when I hired a private investigator and a forensic accountant to look into my family's finances. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. I walked from my kitchen to my home office and opened my laptop. The folder was right where I always kept it, labeled simply evidence. Inside were hundreds of files. Financial records showing credit cards opened in my name when I was 19, debts I never knew existed until they nearly destroyed my future. Email threads between my aunt and a company that specialized in the kind of loans no legitimate bank would approve. And the document that changed everything, a handwriting analysis proving that the signature on Grandmother Ruth's will did not match any verified sample of her actual handwriting. They had forged it. My mother had forged my grandmother's will and stolen the house that was supposed to be mine. For 5 years I had built my company in silence. I had gathered evidence in secret. I had watched my family from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal what I knew and reclaim what they had taken. My father's retirement party was that moment. I looked at the invitation still sitting on my counter, staff accommodation for B. Foster. They were expecting the quiet, forgettable daughter who would stand in the corner and accept whatever scraps of acknowledgement they offered. They had no idea who I had become. I closed my laptop and picked up the invitation one more time. My reflection caught in the darkened screen, and for a moment I saw both versions of myself. The scared 15-year-old who believed her mother's lies, and the woman who had spent 5 years preparing to expose every single one of them. I whispered to myself in the quiet of my empty apartment. 5 years of waiting, one night to end it all. The Whitmore Country Club looked exactly as I remembered from the photographs my mother used to share in family group chats. Tall white columns framed the entrance and luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway like expensive jewelry on display. I had never been invited here before, despite my family holding memberships for over a decade. Tonight was my first time seeing it in person, and I was arriving through a door I had not planned to use. I wore a simple navy blue dress, professional, but modest, the kind of clothing that communicated competence without demanding attention. My hair was pulled back neatly, and my only jewelry was a thin silver necklace that Grandmother Ruth had given me on my 13th birthday. I wanted to look presentable without appearing like I was trying to compete with anyone. I was not here to compete. I was here to observe, to wait, and when the moment arrived, to act. A young staff member approached me before I reached the main entrance. He was holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of polite smile that service workers learn to keep frozen on their faces during long events. "Excuse me, are you with the security team?" he asked, glancing at my modest attire and then at the logo on the uniforms of the guards standing near the door. "The service entrance is around the side. You can check in with the coordinator there." I looked at him for a moment without speaking. He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, perhaps sensing he had made an assumption he should not have made. I could have corrected him. I could have told him I was Richard Foster's daughter, that I was on the guest list, that I had every right to walk through the front door like everyone else. Instead, I smiled and said, "Thank you. I appreciate the direction." I walked around the building to the service entrance past the catering trucks and the staff members carrying trays of champagne glasses. None of them looked at me twice. I was invisible here, just as I had always been invisible to my family. But tonight, my invisibility was a weapon I intended to use. The ballroom was magnificent, in the way that expensive things often are beautiful on the surface, but cold underneath. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over round tables draped in white linen. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while guests mingled with glasses of wine and practiced laughter. I recognized several faces from my father's professional circle, people I had heard about but never met, because I was never important enough to introduce. I spotted Grace before she spotted me. My younger sister stood near the entrance, greeting guests with the natural charm she had inherited from our mother. She wore an emerald green dress that complemented her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup. Grace was 33 years old, 4 years younger than me, and she had spent her entire life being everything I was not. The favorite daughter, the beautiful one, the one whose accomplishments were celebrated and whose failures were excused. She saw me approaching, and her smile flickered just for a moment before settling back into place. "Bethany, you actually came?" she said, leaning in for a hug that felt more like a formality than affection. "I was not sure you would make it. I know how busy you must be with your night shifts and everything." "I would not miss Dad's retirement party," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Grace tilted her head slightly, her eyes scanning my dress with the kind of quick assessment that women learn to perform on each other. "Are you sitting with us at the family table, or did they put you somewhere else? I know the seating was complicated with so many important guests." Before I could answer, our mother appeared at Grace's elbow. She was wearing a cream-colored gown and diamonds that sparkled under the chandelier light, looking every bit the wife of a successful man. She glanced at me with an expression that suggested she had not expected me to actually attend. "Bethany," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth as a business handshake. "How nice that you could join us. Grace, come with me. The Hendersons just arrived, and they specifically asked to speak with you." She pulled Grace away without another word to me, without asking how I was, without acknowledging that her eldest daughter had just walked into a room full of strangers wearing a dress she had bought with her own money earned from her own work. But just before Grace turned to follow, I saw something cross her face. A flicker of something that looked almost like guilt, or perhaps apology. Her eyes met mine for just a second, and in that second, she did not look like the perfect daughter. She looked like someone carrying a weight she could not name. Then she was gone, absorbed into the crowd of important people who deserved her attention more than I did. A staff member directed me to my assigned table, which was positioned near the kitchen entrance, far from the elevated platform where my father would give his speech, and even farther from the family table, where my parents and Grace would sit. I was not surprised. I had stopped being surprised by these small cruelties years ago. I had barely settled into my chair when a familiar voice called my name. "Bethany, sweetheart, is that you?" Aunt Ruth approached my table with her arms already open for an embrace. She was my mother's younger sister, around 60 years old, with the same sharp features but softer edges. She had always presented herself as the kind aunt, the one who remembered birthdays and sent thoughtful cards during difficult times. She hugged me tightly, and then sat down in the empty chair beside me, placing her hand over mine with maternal concern. "I cannot believe they put you all the way back here," she said, shaking her head with apparent disapproval. "You deserve so much better than this. I have always said you were smarter than anyone in this family gave you credit for. You know I have always been on your side." I smiled at her the same polite smile I had given the staff member who directed me to the service entrance. "Thank you, Aunt Ruth. That means so much to me." She squeezed my hand and continued talking about how proud she was of my independence, how she admired my strength, how she wished the rest of the family could see what she saw in me. I listened to every word while keeping my expression warm and grateful. But behind my eyes, I was remembering the emails I had found, the 15% commission she had collected on every fraudulent loan taken out in my name, the conversations she had with credit companies that should never have known my Social Security number. Aunt Ruth had no idea what I knew about her, and she had no idea that before this night was over, everyone in this room would know it too. Aunt Ruth continued talking beside me, her voice a pleasant hum of compliments and reassurances that meant nothing. I nodded at appropriate moments and offered small smiles when expected, but my attention had already shifted to the elevated platform at the front of the ballroom. The string quartet had stopped playing, and a staff member was adjusting the microphone stand. The main event was about to begin. My father stepped onto the stage with the confidence of a man who had spent 40 years being told he was exceptional. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silk tie that probably cost more than my first month's rent when I started working as a security guard. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his smile radiated the practiced warmth of someone who understood the value of appearances. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone. Even from my distant table near the kitchen, I could see the self-satisfaction in his posture. This was his moment, the culmination of a career built on handshakes and networking, and the careful cultivation of an image that bore little resemblance to the man I knew at home. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. 40 years in financial consulting, 40 years of building relationships, solving problems, and helping clients achieve their dreams. It has been the honor of my lifetime. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I watched my mother beam from the family table, her diamonds catching the light, as she clapped with enthusiasm that seemed almost genuine. My father spent the next several minutes recounting his professional achievements. Major deals he had closed, companies he had advised, awards he had received. Each story was delivered with false modesty, the kind where someone pretends to be humble while ensuring everyone knows exactly how successful they have been. The guests listened attentively, nodding and murmuring approval at all the right moments. Then he shifted his focus to family. "But none of this would have been possible without the support of my beautiful wife, Margaret," he said, gesturing toward my mother. "And of course, my greatest achievement is not any deal I have closed or any client I have served. My greatest achievement is my daughter, Grace." He turned to look at Grace, who sat beside my mother with perfect posture and a photogenic smile. Grace graduated top of her class. She has built a successful career in marketing. She represents everything the Foster name stands for: excellence, determination, and grace under pressure. He paused for the wordplay, and the audience chuckled appreciatively. I could not be more proud to call her my daughter. More applause. Grace accepted the praise with practiced humility, lowering her eyes slightly and pressing her hand to her chest, as if overwhelmed by the recognition. I sat at my table near the kitchen and felt nothing. I had stopped expecting acknowledgement from my father years ago. What I felt instead was the cold clarity of someone watching a performance they had seen countless times before. A voice from one of the front tables interrupted the applause. An older gentleman I did not recognize raised his hand slightly and called out with what seemed like genuine curiosity, "Richard, do you not have another daughter as well? I seem to remember hearing about 2 girls." The room grew quiet. My father's smile remained in place, but something shifted behind his eyes. He had not prepared for this question. He had not expected anyone to remember that his perfect family portrait was missing a frame. He glanced in my direction, and for a moment our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. I kept my expression neutral, giving him nothing. Then he turned back to the audience and laughed, a dismissive sound that cut through the silence like broken glass. "Oh, Bethany!" He waved his hand as if swatting away an insignificant thought. "She is just a security guard." The words hung in the air. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few laughed nervously, the kind of laughter people produce when they are not sure whether something is supposed to be funny, but feel obligated to respond. Grace leaned toward her microphone, perhaps sensing the awkwardness and feeling compelled to fill the silence. "At least she has stable employment," she said with a small smile. The room laughed more openly. This time, the tension broken by what appeared to be sisterly teasing. My mother joined in, shaking her head with affectionate exasperation, as if my career was a charming family joke they all shared. But I was watching Grace. While the rest of the room laughed, she did not. Her smile had faded the moment the words left her mouth, and now she was staring at the tablecloth in front of her with an expression I could not quite identify. It might have been discomfort. It might have been shame. Whatever it was, she was not enjoying this moment the way everyone else seemed to be. I filed that observation away carefully. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. The laughter subsided, and my father returned to his speech, moving on to thank specific colleagues and share anecdotes about memorable projects. The moment passed as quickly as it had arrived, absorbed into the flow of the evening as if it had never happened. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my hands folded calmly on my lap. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not stand up and defend myself or storm out of the room in righteous anger. I had spent too many years being the daughter who reacted, who felt too much, who made scenes that my family could later use as evidence of my instability. Tonight, I was done reacting. Beneath the table, hidden from view by the white linen tablecloth, I reached into my small clutch purse and retrieved my phone. I opened a pre-written message addressed to my assistant, a message I had composed 3 days ago and saved as a draft for this exact moment. The message contained only 2 words: send it. I pressed the button and watched the confirmation appear on my screen. Then I slipped the phone back into my purse and returned my hands to my lap. Aunt Ruth was saying something beside me, probably words of sympathy or solidarity that she thought I needed to hear. I was not listening. I was counting seconds in my head, waiting for the chain reaction I had just initiated. 30 seconds later, my father's phone buzzed loudly in his jacket pocket, the sound amplified by the microphone he was standing near. He paused mid-sentence, frowning at the interruption. My father reached into his jacket pocket with the irritated expression of a man unaccustomed to interruptions during his own celebration. He pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen, probably expecting a message from his office, or perhaps a late congratulations from someone who could not attend. What he saw instead made him freeze. I knew exactly what was on that screen, because I had written the email myself scheduled to send the moment my assistant received my 2-word command. The subject line read, "Urgent legal matter regarding Bethany Foster. Immediate attention required." It was designed to be impossible to ignore, crafted specifically for a man whose entire career had been built on responding quickly to anything that might threaten his reputation. He opened the email. I watched his face as he read the contents, a brief message containing a single link to a financial news article that had been published exactly 12 minutes ago. The timing was intentional. I had coordinated with the journalist for weeks, ensuring the story would go live during my father's speech, during the exact moment when he would be surrounded by everyone whose opinion he valued most. His expression shifted like weather changing before a storm. First came confusion, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand what he was reading. Then came recognition, his eyes widening slightly as familiar words registered in his mind. Finally came fear, a look I had never seen on my father's face in 37 years of being his daughter. His skin seemed to pale under the warm chandelier light, and his hand holding the phone began to tremble almost imperceptibly. The guests closest to the stage noticed first. They exchanged glances, their polite smiles fading into concerned frowns. The man who had been celebrating his achievements moments ago now looked like he had received news of a death in the family. Whispers began rippling through the ballroom, quiet questions about what could possibly be wrong. A woman at one of the front tables, someone I recognized as a colleague my father had mentioned during his speech, took out her own phone with the curiosity of someone who needed to know what had disturbed the guest of honor so visibly. She typed something into her search bar and waited for results. I watched her face as she read, watched her eyes grow wide, watched her mouth fall open in an expression of genuine shock. "Oh my God," she said, her voice carrying further than she probably intended in the newly quiet room. "Bethany Foster, Sentinel Shield Security." She looked up from her phone, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on me at my table near the kitchen. $68 million. The name echoed through the ballroom. Bethany Foster. The same name my father had just dismissed with a wave of his hand. The same name he had reduced to nothing more than a security guard working night shifts while her sister achieved greatness. More guests pulled out their phones, searching for confirmation of what they had just heard. I could see screens lighting up throughout the room, could see faces transforming as they read the same article my father had received. The story detailed everything: the founding of Sentinel Shield Security, its growth from a one-woman operation into a major player in the private security industry, and the merger deal that had just been finalized with one of the largest security corporations in the country. $68 million. My name, my company, my success. Then someone noticed the security guards. "The uniforms," a man near the bar said, loudly pointing at the guards stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom. "Look at the logo on their uniforms, Sentinel Shield. That is her company." Every head in the room turned to examine the guards, then turned to look at me. The woman they had dismissed, the daughter who was not worth mentioning, the security guard who apparently owned the security company protecting this very event. I had arranged that detail specifically for this moment. When my father's assistant had contacted security companies to provide staff for the retirement party, I ensured Sentinel Shield submitted the winning bid. My employees had been guarding his celebration all evening, wearing my logo on their chests, while he told everyone I was nothing. The ballroom fell completely silent. No one whispered, no one laughed. The string quartet had stopped playing at some point, though I could not remember when. Every eye was fixed on me, waiting to see what would happen next. I stood slowly from my chair, smoothing the front of my modest navy dress with calm, unhurried movements. Aunt Ruth stared up at me with her mouth hanging open, all her carefully crafted words of sympathy forgotten. At the family table, my mother had gone pale, her diamonds suddenly looking less impressive against her ashen skin. Grace was watching me with an expression I could not read, something between shock and what might have been relief. And my father. My father stood frozen on the stage, his phone slipping from his fingers and clattering against the wooden floor. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. For the first time in my entire life, he looked at me with genuine fear in his eyes. Not disappointment, not dismissal, not the vague irritation of a man forced to acknowledge a child he wished did not exist. Fear. Pure, undisguised fear of the daughter he had underestimated for 37 years. I began walking toward the stage. Each step was deliberate, measured pace to the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I was not rushing. I had waited 5 years for this moment, had spent countless nights planning every detail, had sacrificed sleep and relationships and peace of mind to reach this exact point in time. I intended to savor every second. The crowd parted before me like water around a stone. Guests stepped aside without being asked their expressions, a mixture of awe and uncertainty. They did not know what was about to happen. They only knew that the dynamics in this room had shifted completely, and the woman walking toward the stage was not the person they had assumed her to be. I climbed the 3 steps to the platform, where my father still stood motionless. The microphone was still on, still waiting, still ready to carry whatever words came next to every corner of the ballroom. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces staring back at me, and smiled. Since my father introduced me, let me properly introduce myself. The microphone hummed softly as I adjusted it to my height, a small mechanical sound that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence of the ballroom. Every face was turned toward me, every conversation suspended, every breath held in anticipation of what I would say next. My father stood 3 feet to my left, close enough that I could see the sweat forming on his forehead, close enough to hear his shallow, uneven breathing. I did not look at him. I looked at the audience, at the colleagues and friends and business associates who had gathered to celebrate a man they thought they knew. "My name is Bethany Foster." I began, my voice steady and clear. And yes, I was once a security guard. I worked 12-hour night shifts at office buildings and warehouses, standing in empty lobbies while the rest of the world slept. I did this for 3 years while putting myself through school, earning degrees in finance and cybersecurity that no one in my family knew I was pursuing. I paused, letting the words settle over the room like dust after an explosion. 15 years ago, I founded Sentinel Shield Security with nothing but a small loan and a determination to never be powerless again. I built that company from 1 employee to over 200. I secured contracts with corporations, financial institutions, and government agencies. And today, as you have apparently discovered, that company completed a merger valued at $68 million. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the sound of people recalibrating everything they had assumed about the woman standing before them. But I did not build my success on nothing. I continued, and my voice hardened slightly. I built it on ruins that this family created. My father made a sound beside me, something between a cough and a protest. I ignored him completely. When I was 19 years old, I applied for my first apartment, a small studio in a neighborhood that was not particularly safe, but it was all I could afford on a security guard's salary. The landlord ran a credit check as landlords do, and that is when I discovered something that changed my life. I reached into my clutch purse and pulled out my phone. I had prepared for this moment, had loaded the document onto my screen before the party began. I held the phone up so the audience could see, though most of them were too far away to read the details. Someone had opened 3 credit cards in my name. The accounts were opened when I was 19 using my social security number and personal information. By the time I discovered them, they had accumulated $47,000 in debt. $47,000 that I did not spend, did not authorize, and did not know existed. Gasps scattered through the ballroom. At the family table, my mother had covered her mouth with her hand. Grace was staring at me with wide eyes, her perfect composure finally cracked. That debt destroyed my credit score. It cost me my first apartment, my first car loan, and nearly cost me the business loan that launched Sentinel Shield. I spent years rebuilding what someone else destroyed in a matter of months. I lowered my phone and looked directly at my father for the first time since I had taken the stage. He was pale, his lips pressed together in a thin line, his eyes darting between me and the audience as if calculating his options. I did not know who did this to me. Not at first. I was too young and too trusting to suspect my own family. But 5 years ago, I hired investigators. I obtained records. I traced every transaction, every signature, every lie. I let the silence stretch, watching my father squirm under the weight of words I had not yet spoken. The accusation hung in the air between us, obvious to everyone in the room, even though I had not explicitly named him. I will not share all the details here tonight, I said, turning back to the audience. This is my father's retirement party, after all. Some conversations should remain private between family members and their attorneys. I placed the microphone back on its stand with careful precision. But I want everyone in this room to understand something. The woman you dismissed as just a security guard, the daughter who was seated near the kitchen, while her sister sat at the family table, that woman built an empire while carrying the weight of a betrayal most people cannot imagine, and she did it without asking for help from anyone in this room. I stepped away from the microphone and walked toward the stairs leading off the stage. Behind me, I heard my father finally find his voice. "Bethany, wait. We need to talk about this. You do not understand the full situation." I did not turn around. I did not respond. I simply walked through the ballroom with the same measured pace I had used to approach the stage, letting the chaos erupt in my wake. Voices rose behind me, urgent whispers and confused questions, and my mother's high-pitched protests that this was all a misunderstanding. The night air hit my face as I pushed through the service entrance and stepped into the parking lot. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool darkness, allowing myself one moment of private satisfaction before the next phase began. Footsteps rushed up behind me, heels clicking frantically against the pavement. "Bethany! Bethany, please stop!" I recognized Aunt Ruth's voice before I turned around. She was hurrying toward me, her carefully styled hair coming loose from its pins, her face flushed with exertion and what looked like panic. "Sweetheart, please," she said, reaching for my arm. "You have to let me explain. Whatever you think you know, it is not the whole story. I can explain everything if you just give me a chance." I turned to face her fully, and whatever she saw in my expression made her stop mid-step. "I know exactly what you did, Aunt Ruth." My voice was quiet, calm, completely devoid of the warmth she had shown me earlier at my table near the kitchen. "The question is whether you want to tell me yourself or let the evidence speak." 2 weeks after my father's retirement party. I sat in a coffee shop 40 miles from my family's usual neighborhood, waiting for Aunt Ruth to arrive. The location was deliberate. I chose a place where no one would recognize either of us, where we could have the conversation that needed to happen without interruption or witnesses who might report back to my parents. The shop was small and quiet, filled with mismatched furniture and the smell of freshly ground beans. I had arrived 30 minutes early to secure a corner table with my back to the wall, a habit I had developed during my years in security work. I wanted to see everyone who entered. I wanted to watch Ruth's face the moment she walked through the door. She arrived exactly on time, which surprised me. I had expected her to be late to make excuses, perhaps to cancel entirely. Instead, she pushed through the entrance looking like she had aged 10 years since the party. Her makeup was carefully applied, but could not hide the dark circles under her eyes or the new lines around her mouth. She spotted me immediately and walked over with the hesitant steps of someone approaching a judgment she knew she deserved. "Bethany," she said, sliding into the chair across from me, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I know you must be angry, but I need you to understand what really happened." I said nothing. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited. Ruth took my silence as permission to continue. She launched into her explanation with the desperate energy of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times. She told me that my parents had been struggling financially when I was a teenager, that my father had made some bad investments and needed cash quickly. She said she had only wanted to help her sister and brother-in-law get back on their feet. She never meant for anyone to get hurt. She loved me like a daughter and would never deliberately cause me harm. "You have to believe me," she said, her voice breaking. "I did not know how serious it would become. I thought they would pay everything back before you ever found out. I was just trying to help family during a difficult time." I let her talk until she ran out of words. I let her spin her narrative of innocent assistance and good intentions gone wrong. I let her convince herself that maybe if she said the right things, I would believe her version of events. When she finally fell silent, I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila folder. I placed it on the table between us and opened it to reveal the first page. "These are emails between you and Continental Credit Solutions," I said, keeping my voice calm and factual. "This company specializes in opening lines of credit using stolen identities. They are not a legitimate lending institution. They are criminals who exploit vulnerable people." Ruth's face went white as she looked at the printed pages. "According to these records, you received 15% commission on every fraudulent account opened in my name. That amounts to over $7,000 in payments made directly to a bank account registered under your maiden name." I turned to the next page. "Here are the deposit records. Here are the dates. Here is your signature authorizing the transactions." "Bethany, please," Ruth whispered. "You do not understand the full picture." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "You were always jealous of my mother. Grandmother Ruth loved her firstborn daughter more, gave her more attention, more praise, more everything. You spent your whole life living in your sister's shadow." Ruth flinched as if I had struck her. "When Grandmother Ruth died and left her house to me instead of to her own daughters, you saw an opportunity. You could finally take something from the family that had always made you feel second best, and you could make money doing it." I closed the folder slowly. This was never about helping family through a difficult time. This was revenge disguised as assistance. Ruth began to cry, tears streaming down her cheeks and ruining the makeup she had so carefully applied. She reached across the table for my hands, but I pulled away. "Please forgive me," she sobbed. "I made a terrible mistake. I was weak and jealous, and I let those feelings destroy my judgment. But I love you, Bethany. I have always loved you. Please tell me what I can do to make this right." I looked at her tears without sympathy. I had spent too many years carrying the consequences of her weakness to feel moved by her regret now. "Apologies cannot repay stolen years," I said. "They cannot rebuild the credit score that cost me my first apartment. They cannot give me back the opportunities I lost because banks saw me as a financial risk before I ever had a chance to prove myself." Ruth wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Then what do you want from me?" "Information." I leaned forward slightly. Grandmother Ruth's will, the one that supposedly left everything to my parents instead of to me. Someone forged that document. Someone signed my grandmother's name to a will she never wrote. I need to know who. Ruth went very still. The tears stopped. For a moment, I saw genuine terror in her eyes, the fear of someone caught between two impossible choices. "I cannot," she whispered, "if I tell you that everything falls apart." "Everything has already fallen apart," I replied. "The only question is, who gets buried in the rubble?" The silence stretched between us. I watched Ruth wrestle with her fear, watched her calculate the costs of truth versus the costs of continued silence. Finally, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Your mother?" she whispered so quietly I almost did not hear. "Margaret signed the documents. She forged the will herself. Your father did not even know until after it was done." I absorbed this information without visible reaction, though inside something shifted and settled into place. The final piece of a puzzle I had been assembling for 5 years. I stood from the table and tucked the folder back into my bag. My mother always said she had nothing to do with the finances. Now I know she had everything to do with destroying my future. The counterattack came exactly 1 month after my father's retirement party delivered in the form of a certified letter from Morrison & Associates, one of the most aggressive litigation firms in the city. My parents had hired serious lawyers, the kind who built careers on destroying reputations and burying opponents under mountains of legal paperwork. The lawsuit claimed defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. According to the complaint I had fabricated, accusations against my own family to damage their standing in the community and extort money from them. The documents painted me as a bitter, mentally unstable daughter who had invented a fantasy of victimhood to explain her own failures. They demanded $2 million in damages and a public retraction of every statement I had made at the party. Within days, the story shifted in the press. News outlets that had initially covered the $68 million merger began running new angles. Anonymous sources close to the Foster family questioned my mental stability. Business reporters speculated about whether the controversy would affect the Sentinel Shield merger. Opinion pieces appeared asking whether successful women sometimes used victimhood narratives to gain sympathy and destroy competitors. The phone calls started coming from my business partners. They were careful and diplomatic, using phrases like "concerned about optics" and "protecting our shared interests." But the message was clear. The merger that had been celebrated just weeks ago was now in jeopardy. Several investors hinted they might reconsider their involvement if the negative publicity continued. For the first time since I had sent that message from beneath the tablecloth at my father's party, I faced the real possibility that I might lose everything. It was nearly midnight when I finally stopped pretending to work and admitted to myself that I was terrified. I sat alone in my office, surrounded by legal documents and unanswered messages. The confidence that had carried me through the confrontation now drained away like water through cracked pavement. The city lights glittered outside my window, indifferent to my crisis. I had been so certain, so prepared. I had spent 5 years gathering evidence, building my case, waiting for the perfect moment to expose the truth. I had imagined this fight many times, but in my imagination, the truth had been enough. I had not fully considered that my family had resources too, connections to lawyers who could twist reality until I became the villain in my own story. The isolation pressed down on me like a physical weight. I had no allies in this fight. My employees respected me, but could not help with a family war. My few friends had quietly distanced themselves from the controversy. I had no siblings I could trust, no parents who would support me, no extended family who had not already chosen sides. I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps I should have kept my evidence private and simply walked away from the family that had never wanted me. Perhaps justice was not worth the cost of losing the company I had built from nothing. Perhaps some wounds were meant to stay buried. My phone rang, cutting through the silence of the empty office. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach tighten. Grace. I stared at her name for 3 rings, my finger hovering over the decline button. Whatever she wanted, it could not be good. She was probably calling on behalf of our parents, trying to manipulate me into dropping the case or accepting some settlement that would make everything go away quietly. Something made me answer anyway. Bethany. Grace's voice was not what I expected. It was shaking, uncertain, nothing like the polished confidence she had displayed at the party. I need to see you. Tonight. Please. I have something you need to see. Why should I trust anything you have to say? Because I found something. She paused, and I heard her take a ragged breath. Something about me. About what they did to me, too. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a diner halfway between our locations, a 24-hour place where neither of us would be recognized. I arrived first and took a booth in the back corner, watching the door with the wariness of someone who had learned that family could be more dangerous than strangers. Grace walked in looking nothing like the perfect daughter from the retirement party. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of makeup, her eyes red from crying. She slid into the booth across from me and placed a folder on the table between us. After the party, I started looking through old files, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Papers Mom and Dad kept in the safe, financial records I never had reason to examine before. She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. I recognized the format immediately because I had seen similar papers in my own investigation. They opened accounts in my name too, Grace said. Credit cards, a car loan, a line of credit I never knew existed. Her hands trembled as she pointed to the dates. This started when I was 22. They have been using my identity for over a decade. I looked at the documents, then looked at my sister, the woman who had mocked me at the party, the daughter who had been celebrated while I was dismissed, the favorite child who had everything I never had. I spent my whole life thinking I was special to them, Grace said through tears. I thought they loved me more than you. I thought that was why they treated me differently. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Turns out I was just another asset they could exploit. 2 months after the retirement party that changed everything, I sat in my lawyer's conference room waiting for my sister to arrive. The office occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city stretching toward the horizon. My attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in financial fraud cases, had arranged the meeting after I explained the unexpected development with Grace. I was not sure what to expect. The conversation at the diner had revealed a side of Grace I had never seen before, but 33 years of being treated as the lesser sister could not be erased by one tearful meeting. Trust I had learned was built through consistent action over time, not through words spoken in moments of crisis. Grace arrived exactly at the scheduled time, carrying a large envelope and wearing an expression that seemed caught between determination and fear. She looked different than she had at the party, different even than she had looked at the diner. The polished perfection had given way to something more human, more uncertain, more real. Patricia showed her to a seat across the table from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence held the weight of decades of distance of birthdays I spent alone while she was celebrated of achievements that went unnoticed, while hers were praised. Before we begin, Grace said, her voice unsteady, I need to say something. I nodded but did not encourage her. Whatever she needed to say, she would have to find the courage to say it on her own. I am sorry. The words came out thick with emotion. I am sorry for every cruel comment I ever made, every time I looked down on you, every time I laughed when they dismissed you or made you feel small. Tears began sliding down her cheeks, but she did not stop to wipe them away. I genuinely believed I was better than you. I thought Mom and Dad loved me more because I was more lovable, more successful, more worthy of their attention. She paused to take a shaky breath. Learning the truth about what they did has destroyed everything I thought I knew about my childhood, about my family, about myself. She looked directly at me, her eyes red and swollen. I was not the favorite daughter. I was just the one they had not finished using yet. I listened to her apology without interrupting, letting her words fill the space between us. When she finished, I did not rush to offer comfort or forgiveness. Instead, I spoke the truth as I understood it. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. But apologies are just words. Trust is built through actions over time. I am willing to work with you, Grace, but forgiveness will have to wait until I see who you choose to become." Grace nodded, accepting my terms without argument. Perhaps she understood that anything else would have felt hollow. Patricia cleared her throat gently, signaling that it was time to move to business. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing the combined evidence that Grace and I had gathered. What we discovered was far worse than either of us had realized individually. The documents revealed systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 decades. Our parents had opened accounts in both our names, cycling debt between different identities to avoid detection. They had manipulated family trusts, diverted inheritance money, and created a web of financial deception so complex it had taken years for anyone to notice the pattern. Then Grace shared something that made Patricia set down her pen and look up sharply. "I remember something from right after Grandmother Ruth died," Grace said slowly, as if pulling the memory from deep storage. "I was 17, and I had come home early from a friend's house. Mom and Dad were in the study with the door closed, but I could hear them talking." She paused, gathering herself. "Dad said something about the will being handled. Mom said she had taken care of the signature, and no one would question it because she was the eldest daughter. They stopped talking when they heard me come in, and I never thought about it again until now." Patricia leaned forward. "You were saying you overheard your parents discussing the forgery of your grandmother's will." Grace nodded. "I did not understand what it meant at the time. But now, with everything else we have found, I know exactly what they were talking about." Patricia turned to me with barely contained excitement. "Combined with the handwriting analysis we already commissioned Grace's testimony, could prove the will was forged. This is significant, Bethany. This changes everything." We discussed strategy for another hour, weighing options and consequences. Criminal charges were possible, but would mean a public trial, media attention, and the possibility of sending our parents to prison. I had no interest in that outcome. What I wanted was acknowledgement and restitution, not destruction. I turned to Grace and laid out her choice clearly. "I am proposing a private settlement, full acknowledgement of wrongdoing, transfer of Grandmother Ruth's house to a charitable foundation, and financial compensation for both of us. No criminal charges, no prison time. But for this to work, you need to be willing to testify against them if they refuse to settle." Grace did not hesitate. "I will do it," she said firmly. "Whatever you need. This is my chance to become the person I should have been all along." Patricia picked up her phone and dialed a number we all knew by heart. The line connected, and I heard my father's voice answer with the wary tone of a man who knew bad news was coming. "Mr. Foster, this is Patricia Chen, representing your daughters Bethany and Grace," she said calmly. "You have 1 week to decide, settlement or trial. There is no third option." 3 months after the retirement party, where my father called me just a security guard, he requested a private meeting. His voice on the phone was nothing like the confident man who had stood on stage celebrating 40 years of success. He sounded tired, defeated, smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything that had happened had physically compressed him into a lesser version of himself. He asked where I wanted to meet, offering restaurants and private clubs, the kinds of places where he had once held court among peers who admired him. I rejected every suggestion. Instead, I chose a simple wooden bench in a public park 15 miles from the neighborhood where I had grown up invisible. There would be no waiters to impress, no colleagues to perform, for no expensive surroundings to remind him of the power he once wielded. I arrived early and sat watching joggers pass and children play on the distant playground equipment. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind of day that felt almost cruel in its cheerfulness given the conversation that was about to happen. I had waited 37 years for this moment, and now that it was here, I felt strangely calm. He appeared at the far end of the path, walking slowly toward me with the hesitant steps of a man approaching his own judgment. When he finally reached the bench and sat down beside me, I barely recognized him. The silver hair that had been perfectly styled at his party now looked thin and unkempt. His suit, once immaculate, hung loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 months ago. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said quietly. I did not respond. I simply waited for him to say whatever he had come to say. He told me about everything that had collapsed since the party. My mother had filed for divorce, moving quickly to separate her assets from his before the legal consequences caught up with them both. Aunt Ruth had been cut off completely after her role in the fraud became known. His friends and colleagues, the same people who had applauded his retirement speech, had quietly distanced themselves from the scandal. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped arriving. The man who had spent 40 years building a network of admiration now sat alone on a park bench with nothing but his failures for company. I am asking you not to release any more information, he said, his voice cracking slightly. The settlement is one thing, but if more details become public, it will destroy whatever dignity I have left. I am an old man, Bethany. I do not have many years remaining. Please let me live them without complete humiliation. I turned to look at him directly for the first time since he sat down. His eyes, which had once looked at me with dismissal and disappointment, now held something that resembled desperation. You want to talk about what you might lose? I said, keeping my voice level and controlled. Let me tell you what you already took from me. He flinched, but did not interrupt. You took my childhood. While Grace received attention and praise, I learned that love was something I would have to earn from people who had no intention of ever giving it. You took my dreams of having a normal family, parents who would show up to my school events, who would remember my birthday, who would look at me with pride instead of inconvenience. I paused, letting each word land before continuing. You took my financial future. Those credit cards you opened in my name cost me my first apartment, my first car, years of opportunities that went to other people, because banks saw me as a risk before I ever had a chance to prove myself. And you took my grandmother's house, the one thing she wanted me to have, the one connection I had to someone in this family who actually loved me. He sat in silence, staring at his hands folded in his lap. He did not deny anything. Denial was no longer possible when the evidence filled folders and the testimony came from both his daughters. I am sorry, he whispered finally. I know that does not fix anything, but I need you to know that I am sorry for all of it. I had imagined this moment many times over the years. In some versions, I screamed at him. In others, I cried. In my weakest moments, I imagined accepting his apology and somehow finding the reconciliation that had always seemed impossible. But sitting beside him now, I felt none of those things. I felt only the clarity of someone who had finally arrived at the end of a very long journey. I do not need your apology, I said. Words cannot repair what actions destroyed. What I need is your signature. I reached into my bag and pulled out the settlement agreement Patricia had prepared. I placed it on the bench between us, along with a pen. Full admission of financial fraud. Transfer of Grandmother Ruth's house to a nonprofit foundation I am establishing. Waiver of all future claims against me or Grace. In exchange, I will not pursue criminal charges, and I will provide you with a minimal monthly allowance so you do not end up on the street. He picked up the document with trembling hands and read through it slowly. I watched his face as he absorbed each clause, each consequence, each admission of guilt that would follow him for whatever years he had remaining. When he reached the signature line, his hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pen steady, but he signed. I took the document back and placed it carefully in my bag. As I stood to leave, his voice stopped me. I never thought you would become stronger than me, he whispered. I looked down at the man who had once made me feel worthless, who had dismissed me in front of everyone he wanted to impress, who had stolen from me, without ever considering that I might one day have the power to hold him accountable. That is because you never thought about me at all. 6 months after my father signed away his dignity on a park bench, I stood on the wraparound porch of my grandmother's house and watched cars pull into the driveway. The Victorian home with the rose garden looked exactly as I remembered from childhood summers, when Grandmother Ruth would sit with me on this same porch and teach me lessons about money and freedom and never letting anyone control my life. The paint was fresh now, the gardens restored, and a new sign hung beside the front door bearing the name I had chosen for this place, Ruth's house. a shelter and resource center for women experiencing financial abuse. I had spent months working with architects and social workers to transform the home into something that could help others the way my grandmother had once helped me. The bedrooms upstairs were now private quarters for women escaping financially abusive relationships. The parlor had become a counseling room. The kitchen, where I learned to bake apple pie, now served meals to residents rebuilding their lives. Every corner of this house held memories of love, and now it would create new memories of safety for women who had nowhere else to turn. The opening ceremony brought together an unexpected collection of people. Advocates from domestic violence organizations stood beside financial counselors and legal aid attorneys. Local politicians who supported the cause mingled with donors who had contributed to the renovation. And scattered throughout the crowd were women who would become the first residents, their faces holding the cautious hope of people who had learned not to trust promises. I gave a brief speech about my grandmother, about what this house had meant to me as a child, about the legacy that had been stolen and was now being reclaimed. I did not share all the details of what my family had done. Some stories belonged to courtrooms and settlement agreements, not dedication ceremonies. Instead, I focused on what Ruth's house would offer: financial literacy classes, credit repair assistance, legal support, and most importantly, a community of women who understood what it meant to be exploited by the people who were supposed to protect you. When the formal program ended, I stepped back and let the guests explore the house and meet the staff. From my position near the porch railing, I spotted Grace standing at the edge of the garden, keeping a respectful distance from the celebration. She looked different than she had at our father's retirement party, different even than she had looked in the lawyer's office when we combined our evidence. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple blouse and slacks that suggested someone no longer trying to impress. Her hair was pulled back practically rather than styled elaborately. She looked like a woman who was learning to exist without the armor of perfection. We had not become close sisters. The years of cruelty and competition could not be erased by a few months of reluctant cooperation. But something had shifted between us, something more honest than the false dynamic our parents had created. Grace had testified against them as promised. She had found a job at a nonprofit organization, earning modest wages while building an identity separate from the family name that had defined her for so long. She was learning who she might become without the pressure of being the favorite daughter. She caught my eye across the garden and nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any words we might have exchanged. I nodded back. It was enough for now. Perhaps it would always be enough, and perhaps someday it might become more. Either outcome felt acceptable. Our mother and Aunt Ruth had made no contact since the settlement was signed. They had retreated into their own versions of the story, probably casting themselves as victims of my vindictiveness rather than architects of my suffering. I did not care what narrative they told themselves. Their absence was a gift I had not known I needed. My father lived alone in a small apartment across town, surviving on the monthly allowance I provided as agreed. I did not visit him. I did not call. The settlement had included everything I needed from him, and there was nothing left to say. He had his signature on a document admitting what he had done, and I had my grandmother's house transformed into something that would help others. The scales were as balanced as they would ever be. The crowd began to thin as the afternoon light softened into early evening. I was preparing to go inside and thank the staff when I noticed a figure approaching the front gate. A young woman, perhaps 25 years old, walked slowly up the path carrying a small child on her hip. Her clothes were worn but clean, her face pale with exhaustion, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting to be turned away. She reminded me of myself at 19, standing in a landlord's office, learning that my credit had been destroyed by people I trusted. She had the same look of someone drowning in circumstances she did not create and could not understand. I walked down the porch steps and met her at the garden entrance. "Welcome to Ruth's house," I said gently. "Are you looking for a safe place to stay?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I do not have anywhere else to go. My husband controlled all the money. I do not even know how much debt is in my name." I reached out and touched her arm softly, offering not charity, but solidarity between survivors. "You are not alone anymore," I said. "Come inside. We will figure this out together." I watched her walk through the front door of my grandmother's house, her child's small hand waving over her shoulder. The door closed behind them, and I stood alone on the porch where my journey had begun so many years ago. I used to guard buildings. Now I guard my own life. And for the first time, I am living without asking anyone's permission to exist. Bethany's story proves that the people who try to break you often become the reason you discover your own strength. She turned decades of betrayal into a legacy of helping others, and she did it all without asking permission from the family that never believed in her. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have supported you? How did you prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might inspire someone else who is going through the same thing right now. If this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. We share stories like this every week, stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay silent and find the courage to reclaim their lives. Thank you for watching until the end. Your support means everything to this channel.